Kia ora koutou whānau. Welcome to all the new faces in the audience that have just arrived, and hello again to all of those of you stuck with us from this morning. Lots of people have been in it for the long haul, so kia ora, and welcome to this awesome session that we've got lined up. So this is the Peter Wells Lecture, and each year Same But Different asks a different LGBTIQ author to deliver a lecture that examines queer life and queer writing in Aotearoa. It's named the Peter Wells Lecture after our founder, Peter Wells, who founded Same But Different in 2016 and sadly passed away in 2019. So each year we have this lecture, and it's an opportunity to remember him, and also, we try and invite to people to challenge and inspire us in some way. And we're really, really delighted to welcome the wonderful Etta Bollinger, who's going to be giving the Peter Wells Lecture this year. I won't say too much about what Etta's going to talk about. I'll leave them to introduce that for you all. But I will read this helpful bio I have here about them. So, Etta Bollinger is a writer and disability rights advocate. Etta has had poems appear in Starling, Mimicry and Scum magazines, and plays staged in New Zealand, Australia and the UK. Their first book, Articulations, is a collection of essays about their experiences as a disabled queer person and a twin. It was published September 2023 by Tender Press. So Etta, welcome. We're all really excited to hear from you today, and know that you're amongst friends, and enjoy it, and we're really looking forward to hearing to what you have to say. So kia ora and welcome.
Kia ora hui mai tātou I tēnei whare. Tēnei te mihi kia rangi nui e tui honei, kia papa tuanaku e tākato nei tēnā kōrua. Ko te mihi toerua ki ngā mana whenua o te rohi nei, aha koi whānau mai ai, ahau ki te whanganui ātara I tipu ake au ki tamaki makaurau ki konei, ko te kura o ngā puna o Waiorea, he puna reo Māori me ona tikanga māku. Nā reira, hei tauira, hei kaituhi, hei Pākehā, hei tangata tiriti, kei te mihi, kei te mihi, kei te mihi. Toitu te mana, toitu te reo, toitu te tiriti. Ki ngā mate o te wā, haere, haere, haere atu rā. I tēnei pō, aha koa ka huri aku mahara ki aku tipuna hurei, ki aku tipuna takapui hoki, nā rātou te kōrero nei, ka huri hoki oku mahara ki ngā tangata, ki ngā iwi o Paratini, mai te awa ki te moana ka ora ai te iwi. Kei te mihi hoki ki ngā kai whakahaere o tēnei hui nei. Kia ora, my name is Etta Bollinger. I am descended from Pākehā ancestry, German, Irish and English on my father's side, and English, Irish, Scottish on my mother's, and I was just saying there that what I'm about to speak to has a lot to do with my Jewish heritage, but while I wish to highlight that, my heart is also breaking for the people of Palestine. This is the first time I've given a memorial lecture, a space created in memory and by other people's memories. And I'd like to briefly locate myself in relation to Peter Wells, because it gives me a way to ground multiple strands and identities that I'm going to talk about tonight. I became properly aware of Peter Wells's work a couple of years ago when I was rehearsing for a play by American playwright Larry Kramer's Call to Arms, The Normal Heart, and it was a surprise to find myself rehearsing for a play. I usually write them so that I don't have to worry about what the writer might think of my interpretation. But as I was enthusiastically sharing the audition notice for the role of Dr. Bruckner with my friends, I thought, wait, how often does a role like this come up? Queer history and a disabled character drawn from real life. And she gets to yell things at the medical establishment, like, how does it always happen that all of the idiots are always on your team? An amateur company was actually looking to cast a disabled person, which hardly happens. The role, based on the pioneering AIDS Dr. Linda Lovenstein, was taken on by the wonderful British queer and disabled actress Liz Carr for the National Theatre production in 2022, just before our community production was staged. But up until then, the role had not been performed on a professional stage by an actual disabled person for over 35 years. I wondered if, like me, although Liz Carr is a much more experienced actor, I wonder if she tackled her nerves about taking on a role once played by Julia Roberts by saying, well, at least I'm more disabled than she is. And incidentally, the role of Dr. Bruckner excited me because I noticed that Bruckner is an anglicised German name, which you'll see is relevant to me later. During that process of preparing for this show, I spoke to my maternal grandmother, Elizabeth McRae, who's an actor who trained under the Jewish actress and refugee Maria Dronka, née Kronfeld. She told me about the Peter Wells film, A Death in the Family, in which she'd played Auntie Pam, an aunt who witnesses her nephew's decline with AIDS and is considered a soft touch by her own family for being there for him. This opened up a conversation for us about the gay men she had known and lost in her life and career. And being in the middle of trying to do justice to a story from that era, hearing from her made it more real and meaningful for me. Alongside the other reading and conversations I'd been doing to try and get insight into how women loved and lived alongside the tragedy or failed to do this, it also personally helped me understand some of the soft landing and acceptance I'd had as a queer person in my own family, something I know is not a given. It was exciting to explore a role like Dr. Bruckner because her empathy for queer people seemed to so clearly come from her experiences of exclusion and ostracization and ableism as a polio survivor. Not to mention that at the time I was playing her, I had just been watching my own community navigate a pandemic, one in which the needs of disabled people globally were glossed over, where disabled people were reluctant oracles. I thought about the solidarity, the seeing of common ground between the discrimination that people with HIV/AIDS and disability rights activists had experienced, how in New Zealand they'd taken that and leveraged it to make sure that both communities were covered in the Human Rights Act, a collaboration that was much slower in America. In rehearsal, I could be comfortably queer on stage once the ramp was installed. I could vent. What am I arguing with you for? You don't know enough medicine to treat a mouse. You don't know enough science to study boiled water. How dare you come down here and judge me? The joy of embodying both my queerness and disability on stage at once is an example of why I'm so excited that my first published book, Articulations, is now being received as queer writing, although it may have a more obvious emphasis on disability rights. For me, I can't really separate my identities as disabled and queer. And there is a rich conversation to be had between the identity groups about how to share knowledge, not perpetuate exclusion, and instead grow community, pride, and access. And so, I want to start gratefully to those holding this space to tell stories, but also by saying that I find the concept of queer resilience that I've been invited to speak about uncomfortable and difficult. I often hear the government speak about resilience of communities responding to floods, attacks, pandemics, and to being beneficiaries and navigating their everyday lives. It feels to me like a word that has started out collective and hopeful and now gets used to hand over systemic problems to individual people. What I've written in my own book about interdependence also illustrates the idea of resilience. When you haven't practiced it, it looks like opting into something. It feels like a moral choice, and sometimes it looks easy. Part of facing the, I should have practiced this word, Anthropocene together will be learning to talk about our discomfort with need and dependence, the wrench of stepping away from a culture that prizes self-reliance, a culture that adulates people who embody it, and hates and forgets those of us already practicing interdependence. When interdependence is your way of getting out of bed in the morning, you have to become intimately acquainted with its joys and uncomfortable compromises. Sometimes it is a beautiful exchange. In those moments, I know the other person is getting something out of helping me meet my needs. Or else, the relationship feels reliable, long, and deep enough to know that it will eventually flow in both directions. Even more rarely, I have the feeling that there is no need for an exchange, that being is enough. Change will involve talking about our need to categorize forms and degrees of dependence as acceptable and unacceptable, good and bad, as something we should ultimately grow out of. Resilience to me is a survival skill in the same way. As a disabled person, I draw on it when, once again, someone has misunderstood that wheelchair access does not mean the same entrance as the rubbish bins. I draw on it when support and equipment I need in daily life is treated like a nice to have. I draw on it when I'm misgendered by people who have my gender on file. I draw on it generally when systems have failed me, when community and care are absent from the places I would like them to be. And so in those moments of exclusion, I am wary of holding it up amongst ourselves as minority people as an aspirational quality, the thing we have had to become in response to exclusion and navigating an inhospitable world on a daily basis. Tonight, I'm going to talk about a story about disability that I've already told. And I also want to talk about a story of queerness and how resilience, for me, might seem like a more useful and hopeful idea if I think of it happening across time. There are two things that you need to know about me to understand this talk, and they are not the ones printed on the back of my book. But we'll get back to those. One is that I've always wanted to be a writer, and the other is that I've always wanted to travel to Germany. Both the writing and the German have been childhood interests or obsessions, you might say. I remember my paternal grandmother Marai writing down word for word the story of a magic cat I had told her as a 6-year-old. She also taught me my first German sentences. Things like, I have a cold, I want to draw with crayons, all I really want is a pet parrot. Some of these sentences have been more useful than others. But both writing and German have always been part of who I am. Not only because words fascinate me, but also because I've always been curious about my grandmother's German Jewish heritage. At 9 years old, my grandmother told me she only spoke Kinderdeutsch, or children's German, and so I pestered my parents until I had a German teacher. In 2023, I got the unexpected opportunity to travel to Germany with both my parents and explore our German heritage. Afterwards, people kept asking me how the holiday had been. I didn't really see it like that. I kept reaching for words and finally came up with a description that we had been on an adventure into family heritage. And I'll tell you about that adventure in a minute. But first, I want to tell you about the only thing that made me willing to keep that trip short. And that was the imminent publication of my first book, which I launched with the support of Tender Press in Wellington. And if anyone was in the previous session, you will have just heard from one of my amazing editors, Stacey Teague, and the other that I need to thank is Ash Davida Jane, and they were an incredible team for birthing that book, so thank you. But yes, jumping from dream to dream was the only way to find myself willingly and happily planted back in this corner of the world. And there are ways that publishing a book has been an amazing and unexpected experience in its own right. I guess a launch felt like it was the end of something. That's what I expected, having spent 3 years with the ideas and them also being about your everyday life that you are living anyway. Sending that into the world can't help but feel like an ending. But really, I found that it's the beginning of a conversation. This can happen asynchronously in ways where I only find out later that someone has read my book and absorbed it in their own way. But also, because of technology, I'm hearing people's responses to it in real time, being sent pictures of people getting their copies in the post, or actually it being shipped personally by plane to Australia, in one case, and people photographing paragraphs that have resonated with them. I've heard people say that they enjoy it, but I've also heard people say that they found out unexpected things about themselves as disabled or queer people, and that's incredibly gratifying, to see the significance for people of their lives being reflected in words. There are so few disability stories. There are so few queer stories, and there are so few where we get to be both. So there is joy in finding and creating them. When I was writing my book, I thought a lot about the fact that it would have multiple audiences. There's the audience that it's dedicated to, those of us who are living to crip time. But there is also any combination of queer, disabled, straight, and non-disabled readers too. You have to accept when publishing a memoir that to some extent you are handing over your life for interpretation. You have to shrug and say, well, they know that about me now and I brought it on myself. But being disabled in an ableist world, people often think they are entitled to know about your life and body whether you are a writer or not, in ways that some queer people will recognise. I write in my book that explaining myself is almost a reflex. I was, and still am, the family holder of names and dates and connections between people. It is my job to remember things. I always laughed at my family for drawing blanks. I was proud of being depended on to fill the gaps. I felt useful. I would also remember the names of diagnoses and operations, the dates they happened, words that were precociously long for my small tongue. Doctors would test my reflexes and I would jump. I would walk for doctors too. And I could never really tell what they thought, but talking, I knew that impressed them. I told them things. I was good, I told them things. I showed my uneven gait, my spine, my hips, and talked about them. Tension, dysplasia, spasticity, tone, contractures. I could name and date my operations. 8th of October 2001 was the first. It was made up of at least 2 procedures, an adductor release and tendon transfer, whatever those actually mean. It was easy to remember because 8 and October match. I know that October used to be the 8th calendar month like an octopus's legs, until someone called Julius added July and August after himself and his son. I didn't know the words define right, ego, or patriarch then. I remembered because July is my birthday month. I liked the pattern of it. It was easy to remember because it matched me too. I was 8. See, I can talk in the way you have taught me, a gentle reflex, but also a way to say, I know my body like you know it. Medical words were my second language. Maybe I am revising things too much to say that I was conscious of pushing back against the way other people understood my body. Still, it hummed under the surface of conversations, appointments, exchanges with strangers. There was an ease with which I explained my body to anyone who asked, without asking myself what I wanted them to know, without much reflexivity. I handed over the whole story. In some ways, being asked to explain my disability in daily life meant that by the time I wrote a book, I was used to it. But I also wanted the book to push against the assumption that we should share. We find stories to tell about our bodies, to explain them because the questions will always be asked, but there is no triumphant narrative arc. It is more daily, more circular, more mundane than that. Sometimes I can accept the way you look at me, sometimes I don't. In the book, parts have been redacted. This is a deliberate move to claim some of the story for myself, to show what I'm not willing to share with the world, what I want to keep sacred and private. Diagnosis, conversations between myself and support workers, myself and sex workers. I'm trying to prompt people into wondering why they feel entitled to the answers to their invasive questions. Finding a balance of what I'm willing to share has not only felt like taking something back from an ableist world, but has also created space for me to choose when I want to continue the conversations that interest me, to give something back. Over the past year, I've found that that's usually directly with my own community. At my launch, I told people, someone recently asked me if I considered my writing activism, and I said yes. Writing about disabled lives feels necessary and urgent to me. I really do hope that telling our stories from the inside out is some small part of changing how the world sees us and we see ourselves. Storytelling is an obvious form of activism for someone like me, because the traditional ways of protesting and making change are generally pretty inaccessible. I can write without needing to arrange support. It requires me to show up at a desk rather than a march. And if all my well-laid access plans fall over, I can still write from bed. Many disabled writers, especially writers of colour, have written about bed as the place to work, write, rest, and resist. I remember once being invited to a hui by someone who had always seen me as both disabled and queer. I trusted going because I knew the access would have been considered, that I'd actually be able to show up. Some people were surprised to see me there because they knew me as a disability advocate and hadn't realised I was queer. I'd come out in Auckland, and since I'd been in Wellington, I'd found that many queer spaces were inaccessible. And there's also pervasive ableism that means there is a cultural fear and erasure of disabled people's sexualities. I wasn't surprised that I'd been more able to have visibility as one kind of activist and not another. What surprised me more was that I found it hard to locate myself in queer space. Because of everyday ableism and the work I'd done in disability rights, my disabled identity was more immediate for me. It is interesting to me that I felt more entitled to an identity as a disabled person, one that I developed in the face of exclusion, where resilience had been required, than one that had been comparatively easy. I want us to be able to develop these identities gently and still be able to claim them as our own. As I say in the book, I was gently, lovingly outed to myself by my family. I was brought up by people who had queer friends and co-workers from working in the arts and had been supporters of homosexual law reform in the 80s. Being gay wasn't an issue. At the Hui, I wanted to speak consciously and respectfully to my experience, while also acknowledging, as I've said, that the acceptance that I'd experienced wasn't necessarily a given. So often queer family is marked by the breaking of ties, the disruption, the remaking and finding of chosen family. When we introduced ourselves, we were asked to share a photo that would summarize something of who we were. I'm not the kind of person who documents in that way. So my phone, as I scrolled through it, was mostly full of pictures of receipts for disability-related expenses and pictures of my cat. I scrolled until I found the screenshot of an old photo. It was of my grandmother and her brother as children. And suddenly I knew how to introduce myself in that space. I held up the picture, which I did try and find and couldn't while I was writing this. I held up the picture and said, "This is my grandmother and her brother as children before they immigrated from Germany. They are the niece and nephew of Dr. Arthur Kronfeld, who worked as a psychiatrist at the Institute of Sexual Sciences with Magnus Hirschfeld." When you say Magnus Hirschfeld in a straight space, it usually means nothing or takes some contextualizing. But that day, in a trans and genderqueer space, it located me immediately. I heard an intake of breath. For those of you who don't know, the Institute of Sexual Sciences existed in Berlin from around the early 1920s up until 1933. It was the home and workplace of Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld, and its maxim was through science to justice. Hirschfeld, a gay man himself, was influenced by the eugenics science of the time. Broadly, it is the same scientific paradigm that drove the Reich's policies and the murder of both disabled and queer people. It is tragic to me that the lens through which he made arguments for equality would later be used against him and lead to his exile and the destruction of his work and book burnings. But at the time, Hirschfeld argued broadly that because sexuality was biologically and genetically determined, it was natural, and we shouldn't force people to change it or live heterosexual lives. It would affect their happiness and that of any future children they had. He was advocating for homosexual law reform in Germany that wasn't actually then achieved until 1994, and is known for identifying a third gender and coining the term transsexual. And I'll just add that that's obviously significant in Western paradigms. The Institute was well known as a safe haven for queer people, and one of his colleagues and co-founder of the Institute was my great-great-uncle, Arthur Kronfeld. It was Arthur's story that I wanted to explore on our recent trip to Germany. I felt an affinity with him. I'd been drawn to his language at 9. I came out at 16. At 18, I'd been part of a study into young disabled women's sexuality, as I identified then, and later started my own research project on disability and sexuality. We both had misgivings about Freud, although his were maybe more informed as he'd known him personally. And himself had become known for a critique of psychoanalysis. Last year, this quest brought my parents and I through the back entrance of a Berlin trade union office where there was the ramp access, and into the place we actually wanted to be, the Magnus Hirschfeld Society. This is a group formed to memorialise queer victims of the Holocaust and has grown to become an archive housing books from and about the Institute and its people, run by a part-time librarian and kept alive by the scholars' interest in the work. The email that I sent before we left New Zealand was one I'd actually drafted about a year earlier, sent to friends to grammar check, and then chickened out of sending. Back then, I just wanted to connect. I wrote that I was a writer, disability advocate, and sometimes sexuality researcher, that I was the great-great-grandchild of Maria Dronke nie Kronfeld, a German Jewish actress who'd escaped to New Zealand and worked teaching drama. She had lost touch with her brother, Arthur Kronfeld, who'd worked at the Institute before he moved, and then moved to Russia to escape Nazism. But with an actual trip on the horizon, I adapted it to ask if they could see us at short notice sometime next month. I had an answer within days, saying they hadn't known about a sister of Kronfeld's in New Zealand, but that he and colleagues, but that a few of the colleagues were happy to host us and tell us what they knew. We ended up meeting with Rolf Dozer, Hirschfeld's biographer, and Andreas Seck, who'd become interested specifically in Kronfeld's theories. Andreas had been given what little information there was, notes of an unfinished biography, and he had responded by becoming Kronfeld's champion and guardian. I learnt that Arthur had had little to do with queer people before being introduced to Hirschfeld through a mutual friend, and that his original reasons for becoming part of the Institute were financial, though through his work he met a number of queer patients. While Hirschfeld argued that we should accept queerness because of its genetic origins, Kronfeld apparently argued that why someone was queer was not the point. The origin didn't matter, but acceptance did. Of course, I'm wary of casting my own ancestor as the more progressive hero here. I still don't know enough about what formed his views. As an visible out gay man, perhaps there was just more at stake for Hirschfeld, and he simply couldn't publicly take a stance that aligns more closely with what we would recognize as a post-war understanding of human rights. But so far, Kronfeld's position lines up with who he was otherwise, also known to be outspoken in his political views as a communist. That said, both men were still working in a medical model, and I know too well that this makes problems of our bodies. I address it in my book like this. I have toyed with leaving out any mention of diagnosis here. I want to avoid writing into the tragic tropes that crowd in on the medical view of disability, but somehow diagnosis asserts itself as a required component. Even if I am writing to decenter it, it insists on being present in order to be shifted. Besides, the contours of the words are so familiar, I reach for them reflexively. I learnt, though, that as a queer non-binary person, I would have made sense to Arthur Kronfeld, a relative working in queer rights, making sense of me before I existed. Arthur Kronfeld left the Institute in 1926, and by 1931 had a senior teaching position at the University of Berlin. By 1933, however, most Jews had been banned from teaching, and by 1935, neither could he. Over time, many Jews were also being progressively banned from theatres, and he encouraged his much younger sister, Maria, who wanted to continue acting, to move from Berlin, where she had a name for herself, to Cologne, where she would be less conspicuous. Maria and her husband John would have 2 children, one of them my grandmother, before eventually fleeing to New Zealand 4 months before the war. In 1935, Kronfeld emigrated to Switzerland, where colleagues in his field tried to help him get citizenship. This was denied, leading both him and his wife Lydia to Moscow, where they became citizens but would not be safe from persecution for long, and the pair would eventually suicide, fearing the approach of Hitler's armies. A few weeks ago, I saw letters written by my great-grandmother asking for assistance from our Foreign Affairs to find her brother. It was painful. But learning about Arthur's life and death, I felt like a loop had been closed. My great-grandmother's uncertainty about her brother's disappearance answered. As a queer person, though, it has opened up a story I want to continue to explore. One of the Hirschfeld Society's current projects is creating a bibliography of the books kept within the Institute's library, a ghost library, a library of absences, I keep thinking of it as. As writing on disability has been a process of choosing what I keep for myself, this next writing journey that I want to take will in some ways be an inverted process of filling the gaps. Exploring Arthur's story and its echoes in my own life will involve combining research with imagining and being in conversation with him. This is the kind of resilience that appeals to me. It is the kind of resilience where you are held by and not held responsible for becoming that way. Our stories, our bodies, our lives, and our loves being known across time. Thank you.